When a hospital worker moves into a 130-year-old room, he discovers his midnight visitor isn't just anyone. She's been waiting nearly a century for someone who'd understand her calling. The clock on the hospital wall showed 11:30 p.m. when Jake finally finished his shift. He worked as a medical technician at City General Hospital, spending his nights looking at x-rays and helping doctors figure out what was wrong with patients. It wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but it paid the bills and helped people, which made him feel good about his work. Jake had been working the night shift for about 6 months now. At first, it was hard to get used to sleeping during the day and being awake all night, but now he actually liked it. The hospital was quieter at night, and he got to work with a smaller team of people who really knew what they were doing. Tonight had been particularly busy. A family had been in a car accident, and Jake spent hours taking pictures of broken bones and checking for internal injuries. The youngest patient was only 8 years old, and Jake couldn't stop thinking about how scared the little boy must have been. These were the moments that reminded him why he chose to work in healthcare, even though it could be emotionally draining. As Jake walked through the hospital parking lot to his old blue Honda, he felt the cool October air hit his face. Fall was his favorite season. The leaves were changing colors, and there was something peaceful about the crisp night air. He drove through the quiet streets of his small town, passing closed shops and dimly lit houses where families were sleeping, safely in their beds. Jake lived in an old house that had been turned into apartments. The building was huge and sat on the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue. Mrs. Rodriguez, the landlady, had told him the house was built way back in 1892. That made it over 130 years old, which explained why everything creaked and groaned when you walked around. The house had been divided into 6 separate apartments. Jake rented the corner room on the 2nd floor, which gave him windows on 2 sides. During the day, when he was trying to sleep, he could see the big oak tree outside his window and watch squirrels jumping from branch to branch. Mrs. Rodriguez was a nice woman in her 60s who lived in the basement apartment. She had warned Jake about the house's personality when he first moved in 3 months ago. The old wooden floors creaked with every step. The pipes made strange noises when someone took a shower. Sometimes doors would swing open by themselves because the house was so old that nothing was perfectly level anymore. "Don't worry about the noises," she had told him with a smile. "Old houses are like old people. They make sounds, but they're usually harmless." Jake parked his car in the small lot behind the house and walked to the back entrance. The porch light was on, casting long shadows across the wooden steps. He climbed to the 2nd floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The single light bulb in the ceiling made everything look yellow and created moving shadows on the walls. His apartment was small, but perfect for one person. When you walked in, there was a tiny kitchen with just enough space for a refrigerator, stove, and small counter. The main room had his bed pushed against the far wall, a desk by the window where he paid bills and read, and a comfortable chair where he watched TV. Jake had never been the type of person to need a lot of stuff. His apartment was clean and organized, with just the basics. A few medical textbooks sat on his desk along with his laptop and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Medical Tech," that his sister had given him as a joke. Tonight, Jake felt more tired than usual. The emotional weight of seeing that injured family had taken its toll. He changed into his comfortable pajamas, brushed his teeth in the small bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. Looking in the mirror, he could see the tiredness in his eyes. Jake had always been a light sleeper, which made living in the old house challenging sometimes. Every creak, every settling noise, every time someone else in the building walked around, he would hear it. His doctor had told him this was probably because of his work schedule and the stress of his job. He grabbed a medical journal from his desk and climbed into bed. Reading helped him relax and forget about the difficult cases he dealt with at work. Tonight he was reading an article about new techniques for detecting internal injuries. It was dry material, but it kept his mind occupied and away from worrying about things he couldn't control. The house was settling into its nighttime routine. He could hear Mrs. Rodriguez moving around downstairs, probably getting ready for bed. Someone on the 3rd floor was watching television with the volume low. These normal sounds actually comforted Jake. They reminded him that he wasn't alone in this big old house. As he read, Jake found himself thinking about how different his life was now compared to a year ago. Back then, he was living with his college roommate in a modern apartment complex across town. Everything was new and efficient, but somehow it didn't feel like home. This old house, with all its quirks and noises, felt more real somehow. The bedside clock ticked quietly as the minutes passed. Jake could feel his eyelids getting heavy as he tried to focus on the medical journal. The words were starting to blur together, and he knew he would fall asleep soon. He had no idea that in just a few minutes his quiet, ordinary night was about to become something he would never forget. Outside his window, the oak tree swayed gently in the night breeze, its branches casting moving shadows across his room. The old house creaked softly, like it was breathing. Everything seemed peaceful and normal, just like every other night for the past 3 months. Jake had no way of knowing that at exactly midnight, his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The old clock on Jake's nightstand made a soft chiming sound as it struck midnight. He had been reading the same paragraph over and over again, his tired brain struggling to focus on the medical terminology. The words about bone fractures and internal bleeding seemed to dance on the page, and he was just about to set the journal aside when he heard something that made him freeze. The sound of his door handle turning. Jake looked up from his reading, expecting to see Mrs. Rodriguez checking on something. Maybe there was a water leak upstairs, or perhaps she needed to check the old radiator in his room that sometimes made strange noises. It wouldn't be the first time she had knocked on doors late at night to deal with the building's endless little problems. But as the door slowly swung open, Jake realized something was different. Mrs. Rodriguez always knocked first. She was polite that way, always respecting her tenants' privacy, and she usually called out, "It's just me," so people wouldn't be startled. This time there was no knock. No voice, just the slow, deliberate creak of the old wooden door opening wider and wider. Jake sat up straighter in bed, his medical journal sliding off his chest onto the blankets. His heart started beating a little faster, the way it did at the hospital when emergency patients came in. He had learned to trust that feeling. It usually meant something important was about to happen. A figure stepped into his room, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, but not Mrs. Rodriguez. This woman was much younger, probably close to his own age. She had long, dark hair that seemed to catch the moonlight streaming through his window, even though the light wasn't that bright. What struck Jake immediately was how she was dressed. She wore a simple white nightgown that looked like something from an old movie. The fabric seemed to flow around her as she moved, and it reminded him of the vintage clothing he had seen in his grandmother's old photo albums. But what really made Jake's pulse quicken was the way she looked at him. Her eyes were a striking blue color, almost like ice, and they seemed to see right through him. Most people, when they accidentally walk into the wrong room, look embarrassed or confused. They apologize quickly and back away. This woman did neither of those things. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a shy, apologetic smile of someone who had made a mistake. It wasn't even a friendly neighbor's smile. It was bold and confident, like she had every right to be there. Like she knew something Jake didn't know. The smile made him feel both curious and uneasy at the same time. "Excuse me," Jake said, his voice coming out softer than he intended. Years of working in the hospital had taught him to stay calm in unusual situations, but this was definitely not something they had covered in his medical training. "I think you might have the wrong room." He spoke gently, the way he talked to confused patients who sometimes wandered the hospital halls at night. Maybe this woman was sleepwalking, or maybe she was having some kind of medical episode. Jake had seen people do strange things when they were on certain medications or dealing with stress. The woman tilted her head slightly to one side, like a curious bird studying something interesting. Her smile never wavered. She didn't seem confused or lost at all. If anything, she looked completely comfortable, like she belonged in his room more than he did. Jake noticed other strange things too. The old wooden floors in the building creaked and groaned with every step anyone took. He had gotten used to hearing Mrs. Rodriguez walking around downstairs, her footsteps announcing her presence throughout the house. He could always tell when someone was moving around in the hallway or in the apartments above him. But this woman's feet made no sound at all. She had walked into his room as quietly as a shadow, and now she stood there looking at him with those piercing blue eyes, completely silent, except for the rustle of her nightgown and the gentle breeze coming through the window. Jake glanced at the mirror on his dresser, thinking maybe he could get a better look at her face to figure out if she lived in one of the other apartments. He had met most of his neighbors, but there were a couple of people in the building he had only seen in passing. What he saw in the mirror made his stomach drop. He could see himself clearly, sitting up in bed with his medical journal scattered on the blankets. He could see his desk, his chair, the window with the oak tree outside. He could see everything in his room perfectly reflected in the old glass. Everything except the woman standing just a few feet away from him. The mirror showed his room exactly as it would look if he were completely alone. There was no reflection of the woman in the white nightgown, no sign that anyone else was in the space with him. Jake rubbed his eyes, thinking maybe he was more tired than he realized. But when he looked again, the same thing happened. She was there, solid and real, looking at him with that mysterious smile. But the mirror insisted he was alone. Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October night air. He had always been a practical person, someone who believed in facts and science and things you could prove. Working in the medical field had taught him to look for logical explanations for everything, but right now, logic seemed to be taking a break. The woman continued to stand in his doorway, her presence filling the small room with an energy Jake couldn't explain. She seemed to be studying him like she was trying to figure something out. Her blue eyes moved from his face to the medical journal on his bed, then to the textbooks on his desk, then back to his face. Jake wanted to say something else, to ask her who she was or what she needed, but the words wouldn't come. There was something about her presence that made him feel like he was in a dream, where normal rules didn't apply and anything could happen. Time seemed to stretch out like taffy. Jake wasn't sure if she had been standing there for seconds or minutes. His bedside clock kept ticking, but it felt like the world had slowed down, like they were existing in a pocket of time separate from everything else. Then, just as suddenly, as she had appeared, the woman began to move backward toward the door. Her eyes never left his face, and that confident smile never faltered. She moved with the same silent grace with which she had entered, her feet making no sound on the creaky wooden floor. Jake watched, mesmerized, as she backed out of his room. The last thing he saw was her face, still wearing that bold, knowing smile before the door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Jake sat in his bed for a full minute, staring at the door that had just closed. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He kept waiting for his brain to catch up with what had just happened, but nothing about the last few minutes made any sense. Finally, he threw off his blankets and jumped out of bed. His feet hit the cold wooden floor, and the familiar creak of the old board snapped him back to reality. Whatever had just happened, he needed to understand it. Maybe the woman was a new tenant he hadn't met yet. Maybe she was visiting someone in the building and had gotten confused about which room was which. Jake opened his door and stepped into the hallway. The single light bulb cast the same yellow glow it always did, creating those familiar dancing shadows on the walls. But the hallway was completely empty. He looked left toward the stairs, then right toward the other apartments. There was no sign of anyone. He walked quickly to the apartment across the hall where Betty lived. Betty was a nurse who worked day shifts at the same hospital where Jake worked nights. They had become friends over the past few months, often passing each other as one was leaving for work and the other was coming home. Jake could see a thin line of light under Betty's door, and he could hear her television playing softly. Some late-night talk show was on, and he could hear the audience laughing at the host's jokes. He knocked gently on her door. "Betty? It's Jake from across the hall. Are you awake?" He heard her footsteps approaching the door, much louder than the silent steps of his mysterious visitor. The door opened, and Betty appeared in her bathrobe, looking concerned. "Jake? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." The word ghost made Jake's stomach flip, but he tried to stay focused on finding a logical explanation. "Did you see anyone in the hallway just now? A woman in a white nightgown?" Betty shook her head, looking puzzled. No, I've been watching TV for the past hour. I would have heard someone walking around out here. You know how these old floors are. Why? What happened? Jake wasn't sure how to explain what he had experienced without sounding crazy. Someone came into my room a few minutes ago. A woman I've never seen before. She didn't say anything, just looked at me and then left. That's really strange, Betty said, stepping out into the hallway and looking around. Are you sure it wasn't Mrs. Rodriguez? Maybe she needed to check something in your room. No, it definitely wasn't Mrs. Rodriguez. This woman was young, maybe our age, and she was wearing this old-fashioned white nightgown. Betty frowned. I know everyone in this building, Jake. There's no one who matches that description. Maybe you were dreaming? You work such long hours and stress can make dreams feel very real. Jake wanted to believe that explanation, but he knew he had been awake. He could still smell a faint floral scent in his room that hadn't been there before. Maybe you're right, he said, not wanting to worry Betty. I should probably get some sleep. But sleep was the last thing on Jake's mind as he returned to his room. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. If this woman was connected to the building somehow, there might be information about her online. He started by searching for the history of his address. The first few results were just basic property records, but then he found something interesting. A local historical society had published an article about the old Victorian houses in his neighborhood. According to the article, his building had been constructed in 1892 by a wealthy family named the Whitmores. The house had been their private residence for over 30 years before being converted into apartments during the Great Depression. Jake learned that the Whitmore family had been prominent in the community, owning several businesses downtown. As Jake read more, he discovered that the Whitmores had 3 children, 2 sons who went off to fight in World War I, and a daughter named Eleanor. The article mentioned that Eleanor had been interested in medicine and nursing at a time when few women pursued careers in healthcare. Jake felt a strange chill as he read that Eleanor had lived her entire life in the house, caring for her aging parents after her brothers died in the war. She had never married, instead dedicating herself to helping sick people in the community, working as an unofficial nurse since she couldn't afford formal medical training. Then Jake found the detail that made his hands shake as he typed. Eleanor Whitmore had died in 1934 at the age of 28 from tuberculosis. According to the historical records, she had spent her final months confined to the corner room on the second floor of the house, the same room where Jake now lived. The article included a photograph of Eleanor taken shortly before her death. Jake stared at the black and white image on his laptop screen, his breath catching in his throat. Even in the grainy old photograph, Eleanor's eyes seemed to look right through the camera. They were described in the caption as striking blue eyes that reflected her strong spirit, those same blue eyes that had looked at him with such confidence just an hour ago. Jake spent the rest of the night reading everything he could find about Eleanor Whitmore and the history of his building. He discovered that Eleanor had been engaged to a young doctor named James Morrison who worked at the local hospital. But James had died in the flu pandemic of 1918, leaving Eleanor heartbroken and alone. The more Jake read, the more connections he found between Eleanor's life and his own. She had been interested in medicine. She had lived in his exact room. She had been connected to the same hospital where he now worked. Even their ages were similar. Eleanor had been 28 when she died, and Jake was 29. As the first light of dawn began to filter through his windows, Jake finally closed his laptop. He was exhausted, but his mind was racing with questions. Had he really seen Eleanor Whitmore's spirit in his room? Or was his tired brain playing tricks on him, creating connections that weren't really there? He tried to think like the medical professional he was trained to be. Stress, lack of sleep, and the power of suggestion could all cause people to see things that weren't there. Maybe reading about the building's history had planted ideas in his subconscious mind, but the rational part of his brain couldn't explain away everything he had experienced. The woman had seemed completely real and solid. He had heard her nightgown rustling. He had seen her facial expressions clearly, and most unsettling of all, she had looked at him like she knew him, like she had been waiting for him. When Jake finally tried to get some sleep as the morning sun grew brighter, he kept thinking about Eleanor's life. She had been trapped in This room during her final illness, probably looking out the same windows he looked out every day. She had died young, with so many dreams unfulfilled. Her plans to work in medicine cut short by circumstances beyond her control. If Eleanor's spirit was somehow still connected to this room, Jake could understand why. This had been her sanctuary, her final refuge, the place where she had hoped and dreamed and ultimately said goodbye to the world. As Jake drifted off to sleep, he found himself wondering if Eleanor was lonely. If somehow across the decades she had recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone else who worked in medicine, someone else who understood what it meant to care for people who were suffering. The thought should have frightened him, but strangely, it didn't. If Eleanor Whitmore was still somehow present in this old house, she didn't seem threatening. That confident smile had seemed almost welcoming. Jake slept fitfully that morning, his dreams filled with images of old hospitals and women in white nightgowns walking through moonlit halls. When he woke up that evening to get ready for his next shift at the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Eleanor was far from over. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake's life took on a strange new rhythm. He would go to work at the hospital, handle his usual duties with x-rays and medical equipment, come home around midnight, and wait. Not consciously at first, but he found himself staying awake longer than usual, reading in bed with one eye on his door. Eleanor appeared 3 more times during those 2 weeks, always at exactly midnight, always wearing the same white nightgown, always with that same confident smile. Each time Jake felt a little less afraid and a little more curious about what she wanted. The second time she visited, Jake was ready for her. He had been thinking all day about what he would say if she came back. When his door opened at midnight and Eleanor stepped into his room, Jake sat up in bed and spoke clearly. "Hello, Eleanor. I know who you are now." She tilted her head at the sound of her name, and for just a moment, her expression changed. The confident smile softened into something that looked almost grateful. She stayed a little longer that night, maybe 5 minutes instead of 2, looking around his room with interest. Her eyes lingered on his medical textbooks and the hospital ID badge he had left on his desk. Jake started keeping a notebook by his bed, writing down every detail of Eleanor's visits. The time she arrived, how long she stayed, what she looked at, how she moved. He approached it like a medical case study, documenting symptoms and looking for patterns. What he discovered fascinated him. Eleanor seemed to appear more often when Jake was having a particularly hard day at work. After difficult shifts dealing with seriously injured patients, she would show up that same night. When Jake felt lonely or stressed about being new in town, Eleanor would be there, standing in his doorway with that reassuring presence. It was as if she could sense when he needed someone to understand what he was going through. During his lunch breaks at the hospital, Jake started spending time in the medical library, researching not just Eleanor's history, but also the history of the hospital itself. What he found amazed him. The hospital had been built in 1920, just a few years before Eleanor's death. In the old records, he found references to volunteer nurses who helped during the flu pandemic and tuberculosis outbreaks of the 1920s and 1930s. Eleanor's name appeared in several documents. She had volunteered at the hospital regularly, helping to care for patients even though she had no formal medical training. The head nurse at the time had written a letter praising Eleanor's dedication and natural skill with patients. The letter mentioned her exceptional bedside manner and intuitive understanding of what people needed when they were suffering. Jake also discovered that Eleanor's fiancé, Dr. James Morrison, had been one of the founding physicians at the hospital. He had worked in the same department where Jake now spent his nights, looking at x-rays and helping diagnose patients. Dr. Morrison had been particularly known for his work with tuberculosis patients, the same disease that would eventually take Eleanor's life. The parallels between their lives and his own were becoming impossible to ignore. Jake began to feel like he was walking in the footsteps of people who had lived nearly a century before him, but who had shared his same passion for helping others. One evening, Jake decided to visit Mrs. Rodriguez to ask her about the building's history. He found her in the small garden behind the house, tending to her roses in the fading daylight. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jake said, approaching carefully. "Can I ask you something about this house?" She looked up from her flowers, wiping dirt from her hands with a small towel. "Of course, Jake. What would you like to know?" "Have you ever experienced anything unusual here? Anything that might seem strange to other people?" Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, looking at Jake with the kind of expression that suggested she knew exactly what he was talking about. Finally, she sighed and sat down on a small garden bench. "You've seen her, haven't you?" she said simply. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "You know about Eleanor?" "I've been living in this house for 23 years, Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Eleanor has been here longer than any of us. She doesn't appear to everyone, you know. Only to certain people." "What kind of people?" "People who work in healing," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "People who understand what it means to care for others who are suffering. We've had doctors, nurses, and medical students live here over the years. About half of them report seeing her at some point." Jake sat down beside her on the bench. "Does she ever hurt anyone? Does she scare people?" Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "Never. If anything, the people who see her say she brings them comfort. One young doctor told me that Eleanor appeared to him during the worst week of his residency, when he was questioning whether he was cut out for medicine. He said seeing her reminded him that caring for others was a calling, not just a job. Why do you think she appears to medical people specifically?" "I think Eleanor never got to fulfill her dream of working in medicine the way she wanted to," Mrs. Rodriguez said thoughtfully. "Maybe she finds peace in watching others carry on that work. Maybe she's still trying to help people heal, even now." That night, when Eleanor appeared in Jake's room at midnight, he was ready with a question that had been forming in his mind for days. "Eleanor," he said gently, "is there something you need me to do? Something you want me to understand?" For the first time since their encounters began, Eleanor moved closer to him. She walked to his desk and looked down at his medical textbooks, then at a photograph Jake had pinned to his bulletin board. It was a picture of him at his graduation from medical technology school, wearing his cap and gown, smiling proudly as he held his diploma. Eleanor studied the photograph for a long time, then turned back to Jake. Her smile was different now, warmer and more personal. She pointed to the photograph, then to herself, then to Jake. The message was clear. She recognized the connection between them, the shared dedication to helping others that spanned nearly a century. Jake understood then that Eleanor wasn't haunting his room in any frightening sense. She was sharing it with him, finding comfort in the presence of someone who understood her passion for healing. In a strange way, they were keeping each other company across the boundaries of time and death. "I get it now," Jake said softly. "You spent your whole life wanting to work in medicine, wanting to help people heal. You did help people, Eleanor. The hospital records show how much you meant to the patients you cared for." Eleanor's smile grew brighter, and she nodded slowly. For just a moment, Jake could have sworn he felt a gentle touch on his forehead, like a cool breeze or a whisper of gratitude. From that night forward, Eleanor's visits felt different, less mysterious, more like a friendship that had developed between two people who understood each other in a way that few others could. Jake began to look forward to her appearances, finding comfort in knowing that someone who had walked a similar path was watching over him. He started talking to her during her visits, telling her about his patients and the cases that troubled him. He would describe the new medical technologies that hadn't existed in her time, and explain how much medicine had advanced since the 1930s. Eleanor would listen with obvious interest, her blue eyes bright with curiosity about the modern world of healing. Jake realized that in her own way, Eleanor was still practicing medicine. She was helping him process the emotional weight of his job, reminding him that caring for others was both a privilege and a responsibility that connected him to generations of healers who had come before him. As October drew to a close, Jake began to sense that something was changing. Eleanor's visits had become more frequent, sometimes every night for a week straight. But there was something different about her demeanor. She seemed more peaceful, less restless. The bold confidence in her smile was gradually being replaced by something that looked like contentment. Jake had been living in the room for almost 4 months now, and his relationship with Eleanor had evolved into something he never could have imagined. What had started as a frightening midnight encounter had become a source of comfort and strength. He found himself working with more confidence at the hospital, feeling like he was part of a long tradition of people dedicated to healing. On Halloween night, Jake had a strong feeling that something significant was going to happen. He couldn't explain why, but all day at work he kept thinking about Eleanor and wondering if this night would be different from all the others. Before leaving the hospital, Jake stopped by the old records department in the basement. He had become friends with Helen, the elderly woman who managed the historical files. She had been incredibly helpful in his research about Eleanor and Dr. Morrison. "Helen," Jake said as he found her organizing some old patient files, "I need a favor. Do you have any photographs of Dr. James Morrison, Eleanor's fiancé?" Helen's face lit up. She had become invested in Jake's research over the past few weeks, fascinated by the connection between past and present. "Actually, I do. I found something last week that I've been meaning to show you." She led him to a filing cabinet and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a collection of photographs from the hospital's early days. Helen flipped through them until she found what she was looking for. "Here," she said, handing Jake a black and white photograph. This was taken in 1917, just before Dr. Morrison left to serve in the war. Jake stared at the photograph. Dr. Morrison had been a handsome man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He was wearing a white doctor's coat and standing in front of the hospital's original building. But what struck Jake most was how young he looked. He couldn't have been much older than Jake himself. "Can I borrow this for tonight?" Jake asked. "I promise I'll bring it back tomorrow." Helen nodded, understanding that this was important to Jake in ways she might not fully comprehend. Jake also stopped at a flower shop on his way home. He remembered reading in Eleanor's biography that white roses had been her favorite flowers. She had grown them in the garden behind the Whitmore house, and Dr. Morrison had often brought her white roses when he came to visit. Back in his room, Jake arranged everything carefully. He placed the photograph of Dr. Morrison on his desk, propped up against his medical textbooks. Next to it, he put the small bouquet of white roses in a simple glass vase. He also wrote a letter, something he had been thinking about for days. The letter was addressed to Eleanor. In it, Jake thanked her for helping him understand that his work was about more than just technical skills and medical knowledge. She had shown him that medicine was about connecting with people, about carrying on a tradition of caring that went back generations. He wrote about how much he admired her dedication to helping others, even when she couldn't pursue formal medical training. He told her about the records he had found at the hospital, documenting all the lives she had touched during her volunteer work. He wanted her to know that her contributions had been remembered and valued. As midnight approached, Jake sat in his chair by the window, waiting. The room felt different tonight, charged with an energy he couldn't quite name. The moonlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter, and even the old house seemed to be holding its breath. At exactly midnight, Eleanor appeared for what Jake somehow knew would be the last time. But tonight, she didn't stand in the doorway. She walked directly into the room, moving with purpose toward his desk. When Eleanor saw the photograph of Dr. Morrison, her reaction was immediate and profound. Her hand flew to her throat, and her eyes filled with tears that seemed to catch the moonlight. She reached toward the photograph but stopped just short of touching it, as if she was afraid it might disappear. Jake watched as Eleanor picked up his letter and somehow seemed to understand what it said, even though he wasn't sure ghosts could read. Her expression grew softer and more grateful with each passing moment. Then Eleanor did something she had never done before. She spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, like wind through autumn leaves, but Jake heard her clearly. "Thank you," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "for remembering us, for continuing the work." Eleanor moved to where Jake was sitting and for the first time reached out to touch him. Jake felt a gentle, cool pressure on his forehead, like the lightest possible blessing. With that touch came a flood of emotions and images. Eleanor's, memories of her time volunteering at the hospital, Her love for Dr. Morrison, her dreams of becoming a real nurse, her final days in this very room. But more than that, Jake felt Eleanor's peace. She had been waiting, he realized, for someone who would understand what her life had meant. Someone who would carry forward the same dedication to healing that had driven her. "I understand now," Jake whispered. "You've been alone here for so long, watching over this room, waiting for someone who shared your calling." Eleanor smiled one final time, but this smile was different from all the others. It was peaceful, complete, full of love and gratitude. She looked once more at the photograph of Dr. Morrison, then at the white roses, then back at Jake. "Take care of them," she said. And Jake knew she meant all the patients who would come through the hospital, all the people who would need healing and comfort. Eleanor began to fade then, not disappearing suddenly like she always had before, but gradually becoming more transparent, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. As she faded, Jake felt a warmth fill the room, a sense of completion and peace that seemed to settle into the very walls of the old house. When she was completely gone, Jake sat quietly for a long time, processing what had just happened. The room felt different now, still old, still full of history, but no longer carrying the weight of unfinished business. Over the following weeks, Jake never saw Eleanor again, but he often felt her presence. During difficult cases at the hospital, when he was working with seriously injured patients or families facing terrible news, he would remember Eleanor's dedication and find strength he didn't know he had. 6 months later, when Jake received an offer for a position at a larger hospital in a different city, he knew it was time to move on. His work with Eleanor was finished, and he was ready to take the next step in his career. On his last night in the room, Jake left the photograph of Dr. Morrison and a fresh bouquet of white roses on the windowsill. Along with them, he left a note for the next tenant, explaining the history of the room and the remarkable woman who had once lived there. "If you work in medicine," he wrote, "you might have a very special roommate. Don't be afraid." Eleanor Whitmore was a healer, and she's still watching over people who dedicate their lives to helping others. Consider yourself lucky if you meet her. As Jake drove away from the old house for the last time, he looked up at his former window and smiled. The room was empty now, but it was also full of love, history, and the continuing spirit of someone who had found peace at last. Eleanor's story was finally complete, but her legacy would live on in every person who chose to dedicate their life to healing others. Jake knew that wherever his career took him, he would carry her example with him, remembering that medicine was not just about science and technology, but about the timeless human commitment to caring for one another.